The afternoon had thinned to a soft grey light that lay evenly over the Grand Union Canal, draining the colour from the fields and leaving the water the shade of tarnished pewter. A narrowboat named the Mary Ann moved southward at a walking pace. Its wooden hull a patchwork of faded green and dull red paint that had been rubbed away in streaks by years of contact with lock walls and towpath brambles. Beneath the tarpaulin stretched tight across the hold rested 17 tons of best Midlands coal, every lump and speck sending up a faint mineral dust that mingled with the damp air and settled on the deck in a fine dark powder. On the stern deck stood the bargee's wife, her right hand resting on the curved wooden tiller, her left hanging loose at her side. Up ahead on the towpath, her husband had just lifted the heavy hempen rope from its coil on the cabin roof, carried it forward past the mast, and slicked the padded loop over his shoulder with a motion so familiar it required no thought. The old Share-Cross mare named Dolly had already begun her steady walk before the rope drew taut, as if she understood the exact moment the slack would be taken up. Her iron-shod hooves met the packed dirt of the towpath with a soft, unhurried rhythm, a sound that travelled back along the rope and into the boat's timbers, becoming a barely perceptible tremor beneath the wife's feet. The rope angled from the mast down to the husband's shoulder in a gentle drooping curve, dripping a few last drops of canal water onto the grass. As the boat came into motion, the water along the bow parted without resistance, making a low, liquid sigh that was more like a whisper than a splash. The wife kept the tiller exactly centered, her body swaying slightly with the boat's gentle roll, her gaze reaching forward along the canal's straight mile that stretched ahead between two lines of cut hedgerows. The hedgerows were trim and low, the hawthorn cut back hard the previous winter so that only a dense green wall of twig and leaf remained, with here and there a stray bramble arching over the water and dipping its thorny tip just short of the surface. Beyond the hedge to the left, a strip of pasture sloped upward, dotted with a few scattered sheep that appeared motionless against the grey-green grass, and further still, a dark line of elms stood against the sky like a low charcoal drawing. To the right lay a stretch of unfenced meadow, its hay already cut and stacked in small beehive-shaped cocks that gave off a sweet dry scent each time the air shifted. Between the meadow and the canal, a strip of reeds grew thick, their brown seed heads nodding in a breeze, too light to feel on the skin, and the only movement among them came from a moorhen that slid silently into the water and vanished before the ripples could reach the boat. The air held that particular damp coolness of an English late afternoon in early autumn, the kind that seems to rise from the ground rather than fall from the sky, carrying the mingled smells of wet earth, coal dust, horse, and the green clean scent of the canal itself. The wife breathed it in without thinking, the way you breathe your own kitchen air. Her hands on the tiller were calm, the left overlapping the right, and the smooth wood had been polished by her grip over so many seasons that it felt warm even on a chill day. She made tiny unconscious adjustments, a push or pull of no more than an inch, to keep the boat tracking the center of the channel where the water was deepest and the bottom mud least likely to drag. The art of it had long since passed from conscious skill into a bodily knowing, the way a bird knows exactly how much to tilt its wings. On the towpath the husband walked with a slow, heavy-footed stride that matched the horse's pace step for step. The rope across his shoulder had worn a smooth hollow in the thick wool of his jacket, a permanent dent that the fabric never quite lost even on Sundays. He kept his head slightly down, watching the ground a few yards ahead for rabbit holes or loose stones, though he knew this stretch of path as well as he knew the creases in his own boots. Those boots were the same pair he had worn for 4 winters, their soles layered with new leather at the cobbler's in Bromston, the toe caps darkened and smoothed by countless brushes against towpath grass. He did not look back at the boat often, only every few minutes, turning his head just enough to confirm that the tiller was still straight, that the wife was still there in her usual posture, that the lantern hook was empty and waiting for dusk. Far away across the fields, a single farm building stood with smoke rising from its chimney in a perfectly vertical column, grey-white against the grey-white sky, so still that it might have been painted there. The chimney smoke was the only sign that anyone else lived and worked in this landscape, and even it seemed to belong more to the earth than to any human hand. The boat slid past it slowly, the farmhouse growing imperceptibly nearer, and then imperceptibly further away over the course of a quarter of an hour, until it was just another smudge behind the hedgerow and then gone. A little later, a footbridge appeared, its simple wooden planks resting on brick abutments, so low that the husband had to release the rope from his shoulder and pass it under the bridge before walking around and picking it up again on the other side. A small interruption to the rhythm that lasted no more than 20 seconds and then healed itself back into the steady plod of hooves. The wife watched the bridge come and go, noting the way the arch framed the sky for a moment before the boat passed beneath and the sound of the water changed, becoming briefly hollow and contained, then opening out again into the wide air. She shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, a movement so slight it barely altered the boat's course, and settled her shawl more securely around her shoulders. The shawl was of grey wool, knitted in a simple pattern of knit and pearl, its edges fringed with tiny knots that her mother had made years before on a different boat on a different canal. It was neither beautiful nor warm enough for deep winter, but it served well for these in-between hours when the sun had gone, but the true cold had not yet arrived. The horse's pace never faltered. The towpath here was firm and dry, having been recently topped with a layer of crushed limestone that scrunched faintly under the hooves, a sound so subtle it could only be heard from the boat when the wind was exactly right. The husband began to hum a fragment of a tune, something half remembered from a lockkeeper's fiddle or a pub sing-song, but he stopped after a few bars and the silence closed back in. It was not an uncomfortable silence, merely the absence of any need to speak. The boat and the horse and the two people moved as one connected system, a small floating world that required no discussion to function. The light had now faded from grey to a deeper shade that could be called neither day nor evening, but some quiet interval between them. The surface of the canal had lost its metallic gleam and was beginning to turn dark, though it still reflected the palest band of sky that hung just above the western horizon. In the water, the reflection of the boat appeared as a ghostly double, the red and green paint turned to charcoal, the wife's silhouette sharp against the pearly light. When a fish rose and took a fly from the surface, the concentric rings spread outward and broke the reflection into a wobbling mosaic that slowly reassembled as the disturbance passed. The wife noticed it without comment, the same way she noticed a cloud crossing the sun or a leaf falling onto the deck. Another mile passed in the same unhurried way. The landscape rearranged itself slowly. A line of willows replaced the elms, their trailing branches dipping into the canal on the far side and sending tiny ripples upstream with the current that was barely a current at all. A wooden milepost stood half buried in the bank, its painted numbers faded to illegibility, and the husband touched it with his free hand as he went by, an old habit whose reason he had long forgotten. The wife saw him do it and smiled without smiling, the corners of her mouth softening for a second before returning to their resting expression of calm attention. The boat rounded a long, gentle curve where the canal opened out slightly, forming a wide reach that served as a winding hole for turning boats, though none had been here for days. The water weeds grew thicker here, strands of dark green trailing downstream like hair, and the boat pushed through them with a soft rustling noise that added a new layer to the quiet chorus of movement. The wife increased her pressure on the tiller by a fraction to keep the boat in the center, and the boat responded obediently, its long wooden rudder biting into the deeper water and guiding the hull past the shallower edges where the mud was close beneath the surface. The first true touch of dusk arrived not as a sudden change, but as a gradual thickening of the air, a sense that the shadows had grown a little longer and the colors a little duller than they had been a moment before. The wife noticed it in the way the hedgerow details began to blur together, the individual leaves losing their edges and merging into a single dark mass. She noticed it too in the way the husband's outline on the towpath became softer, his shape less distinct against the fields, until he was more a moving shadow than a man. He would light the lantern soon, she knew, but not yet. There was still enough light to walk by, still enough visibility to see the path and the rope and the horse's dark flank rising and falling with each breath. She adjusted the tiller slightly, pulling it an inch towards her hip, and the boat responded with a slow, smooth turn that corrected a drift she had only half perceived. The wooden handle was cool now, the day's faint warmth having seeped away into the evening, and she could feel the grain of the wood through her palms, tiny ridges and valleys shaped by decades of use. The water slipping past the stern made a sound like someone folding silk, continuous and gentle, and that sound seemed to grow clearer as the world grew darker, as if the fading of sight sharpened the hearing. The boat moved on, and the canal stretched ahead into the dimness, a pale ribbon leading toward the unseen locks and the night that was now beginning to settle over the English countryside like a slow descending blanket. The horse was called Dolly, a name she had carried for 16 years, and she walked now with the same measured patience she had always possessed, her great feathered hooves clearing the towpath in a slow 4-beat rhythm that never varied by a fraction of a second. She was a Shire cross, heavy-bodied but not tall, her coat a deep bay that looked almost black in the fading light, except where the last grey daylight caught the curve of her rump and revealed a faint coppery sheen. Her mane had been roached short for cleanliness, leaving the powerful arch of her neck bare to the air, and her tail was tied up in a neat knot to keep it from dragging through the mud. She needed no guidance from the man who walked beside her. She knew this stretch of the Grand Union as intimately as she knew the feel of her own stall in the boat-horse stable at Braunston. Her eyes, deep brown and rimmed with long pale lashes, looked straight ahead at the path unwinding before her, registering every shallow and stone without any outward sign of concern. The husband walked on Dolly's left, between the horse and the canal, his right hand resting not on the lead rope but directly on the warm curve of her neck, where the skin was soft and loose and the muscle beneath moved in a slow, steady rhythm. His touch was light, a communication that had long since moved beyond instruction into something closer to simple presence, the same way you might rest a hand on a familiar chair arm or the rail of your own staircase. Every few minutes he spoke a low word, not a command but a sound drawn from the same vocabulary of clicks and murmurs that a ploughman uses with his team, a sound that meant nothing in particular, but told the horse he was still there, still walking, still attending. Dolly's ears swiveled back at each syllable, and then returned to their forward position, tracking some sound the man could not hear. The leather harness that wrapped Dolly's broad chest and shoulders was dark with years of oil and sweat, worked soft as glove leather until every strap and buckle had molded itself to the exact shape of her body. The collar, a heavy oval of padded leather and horsehair stuffing, rested against her shoulders without pinching, and from it the long traces ran back along her flanks to the whipple tree that spread the weight of the tow rope, a polished ash bar that swayed with her stride and creaked softly in its iron rings. Brass fittings caught what little light remained, the buckle of the belly band, the small rings where the reins would pass if reins were used, the engraved plate on the face of the collar that bore the boat's name in curling script. These points of light winked on and off as Dolly walked, appearing and disappearing in a gentle pulse that matched the movement of her shoulders. The rope itself, a 2-inch hempen line that ran from the whipple tree back to the mast of the boat, was stained dark brown from immersion in canal water and rubbed smooth where it passed through the towing block, and it hissed faintly as it cut through the air, a sound just at the edge of hearing. The towpath here ran along a narrow strip of ground between the canal on the right and a strip of meadow on the left, the grass on either side beaten down by the passage of countless boats and horses over many decades. A dark line of trodden earth marked the center of the path, packed hard as cobblestone, its surface polished to a dull shine by iron shoes and bare human feet and the nailed soles of boatmen's boots. On the canal side, the bank slopes down into the water, tufted with coarse sedge, while on the meadow side, the ground rose a few inches to a tangle of yarrow, plantain, and coarse grass that had learned to grow flat against the earth rather than tall. The whole corridor smelled of crushed vegetation and horse, and the clean mineral tang of the limestone gravel that had been laid down in patches wherever the clay beneath had turned to mud in wet winters. These patches of gravel appeared at irregular intervals, the stones varying from pea-sized to the size of a thumb joint, their angular edges worn smooth by weather and hooves. The husband noted each one without conscious attention, adjusting his own stride to walk on the firmest surface, and trusting Dolly to do the same. Where a hollow in the path had once collected rainwater until it became a knee-deep wallow, some long ago lengthman had laid a bed of broken bricks and covered them with a thick oak plank, the wood now grey and split along the grain, but still solid enough that it barely flexed under Dolly's weight. She crossed it in 4 steps, the sound of her hooves changing from a dull thud to a hollow clop and back again, and the husband's boot followed with a softer echo. Beyond the plank, The path narrowed briefly where a willow had thrust its roots out into the open air. The bark worn smooth and shiny as polished furniture by the rubbing of tow ropes over many years. A faint groove had been carved into the wood, a channel where the hempen strands had gradually abraded the living tree, and within that groove the underlying wood was pale yellow, almost white, a scar that the tree had long since healed around. As Dolly walked past the willow, her flank brushed a low-hanging branch, sending a scatter of narrow leaves pattering onto the path and into the water, where they floated like tiny green boats before slowly spinning away into the boat's wake. The husband reached up with his free hand and pushed the branch aside so it would not swing back and strike his face, then released it gently, and the branch returned to its resting position with a soft swish that joined the catalogue of small sounds. The main sound remained the rhythm of hooves. Right hind, right fore, left hind, left fore, a continuous pattern that the husband's own heartbeat had long since learned to match. When he walked the towpath alone with only the horse and the boat behind him, his mind would sometimes empty itself entirely, occupied only with the next step and the next, until miles passed without him noticing. The light during this stretch of the journey underwent a slow transformation that was difficult to name, shifting from the flat grey of late afternoon into something softer and more pearlescent, as if a layer of fine silk had been stretched between the clouds and the earth. Shadows that had been merely soft became indistinct, and the edges of things grew less certain. Dolly's dark coat absorbed the dimness until she was nearly the same colour as the hedgerow shadows, and the brass fittings on her harness no longer sparkled, but instead gave off a muted gleam, the colour of old gold seen through water. The husband's own face, shadowed beneath the narrow brim of his felt hat, revealed only the ridge of his nose and the set of his jaw when he turned his head. The rest was lost in the general dusk. Breathing became more noticeable as the light diminished, perhaps because the quiet of evening amplified small sounds, or perhaps because the cooling air made each exhalation visible for just a moment before it dissolved. Dolly's breath came in steady clouds that rose from her nostrils and hung briefly in the air before disappearing, and the husband's breath joined hers in the same rhythm, a slight white bloom every 4 seconds. The boat behind them breathed too, or seemed to, as the water parted and closed around the hull, with a continuous low inhalation and exhalation that was more felt than heard. The rope creaked as it stretched and relaxed with minute variations in tension, a sound like old leather stretching, and somewhere within the wooden hull the cargo of coal shifted by a fraction of an inch and settled with a soft subterranean crunch. The husband turned his head now and looked back at the boat, a check he performed every few hundred yards without thinking. He saw the wife's figure at the tiller, still in the same position, her shawl a slightly lighter patch of grey against the darkening cabin. He saw the line of the boat, straight and true in the centre of the canal, its wake a delicate V that spread to the banks and disappeared. He saw that the lantern on its hook had not yet been lit, which meant the light was still sufficient for her to see by, which meant he need not stop to light the bow lantern either. He turned back to the path ahead and let his hand drift from Dolly's neck to her shoulder, feeling the great muscles bunch and release in their ancient pattern. A little further along the towpath, a flight of stone steps led down to a water point where boats could fill their barrels, though no one was there now. The steps were slick with moss and dark with damp, and a slow drip of water from a leak in the standpipe had carved a tiny channel down the centre of each tread. Dolly's ears pricked forward at the sound of the dripping, a thin musical note that echoed off the stone, but she did not break stride. The husband glanced at the standpipe as they passed, noting that the brass tap was shut tight and the wooden cover in place, and then the water point was behind them and the towpath continued as before. The first real coolness of evening now began to rise from the ground, not a wind, but a presence, a sense that the earth was releasing the day's stored heat into the air. It crept up through the soles of the husband's boots and through the dense feathering on Dolly's lower legs, bringing with it the smell of wet soil and the faint sweetness of meadow sweet growing somewhere nearby. The husband felt it on his cheeks and on the back of his neck, where the collar of his jacket did not cover, and he knew without checking the sky that the true night was perhaps an hour away. Dolly felt it too, and gave a small shudder, a ripple that passed from her shoulders to her dock in a single wave. And then she settled back into her rhythm, as if the shudder had been a punctuation mark, a small reset before the final stretch of daylight. The towpath widened here into a short section that had been reinforced with stones laid flat to prevent the bank from subsiding into the water, a job done by the canal company the previous summer. The stones were set tightly together, their surfaces covered with a thin crust of dried mud and horse droppings that crumbled under the hooves, and Dolly walked across them with exactly the same measured pace, her shoes striking small sparks from the hidden flint that no one saw. The husband's attention drifted to the meadow on the left, where a line of dark shapes that were cattle stood motionless against the hedge, their heads all turned in the same direction as if listening to something far away. He looked at them for a moment and then looked away, and the cattle remained where they were, black shapes against black shapes, until the boat and the horse and the man had passed and the towpath was empty again. Now the husband began to notice the small repairs to the path more consciously, not because they were new, but because the repetition of walking had brought his mind to a state of calm observation in which each detail presented itself without demanding attention. He saw the gravel scattered in muddy patches, the limestone chips pale against the dark earth. He saw the wooden board laid over a wet hollow, its grain raised by moisture and its edges soft with rot. He saw the roots of the willow tree exposed and polished by rubbing ropes, a landmark he had passed 100 times before. He saw all of these things, and they passed through him like water through a sieve, leaving no residue. Dolly walked on. The rope tightened and slackened with the gentle surge of the boat behind her, and the husband's shoulder took the pull without complaint. The air grew cooler still, and the sky shifted from pearl to a deeper shade that held the memory of blue without any blue remaining. In another half an hour the wife would light the lantern, and he would light the bow light, and the small flames would become the only color in the landscape. But for now there was still a grey luminescence that was enough. The hooves continued their rhythm, the harness continued its soft creaking, and the boat continued its slow, silent passage toward the night. The tiller was not a simple stick, but a long, curved arm of ash that had been shaped by a boat builder's hands more than 40 years before, its grain running in subtle waves from the iron pintle at its base to the smooth, rounded grip where the wife's palms rested. She held it with both hands, her left overlapping her right, the wood exactly the temperature of her own skin after so many hours of contact. The vibration that travelled up from the rudder through the tiller and into her bones was a steady hum, so faint it might have been the boat's own pulse, and it varied only when the water beneath the hull changed in depth or current, registering every shelf of mud and every sudden weed bed as a slight change in the pressure against her palms. After a decade of steering this same boat, she could read the canal's bottom through that hum as clearly as if she could see it. From the stern deck, the world presented itself as a slow panorama that unrolled from right to left, or from left to right, depending on which way she turned her head. But mostly, it unrolled straight ahead along the line of the canal where the towpath ran, and the horse walked, and the husband's figure moved in the growing dimness. The boat's forward progress was so gentle that the landscape seemed to be the thing that was moving, sliding past while the boat remained still at the center of a fixed circle of water. A hedgerow oak would appear as a dark shape far ahead, grow imperceptibly larger for 10 minutes, slide alongside the boat, and then begin its slow retreat into the distance behind. And throughout this entire passage, the wife's gaze might rest on it, without once needing to shift, taking in the way its lower branches overhung the water, and the way its leaves had begun to curl at the edges with the first hint of autumn. The wake streamed out behind the boat in a glassy fan that widened until it kissed both banks, its surface so smooth that it reflected the sky without distortion, a ribbon of pewter light laid over the deeper darkness of the canal. She could see the upside-down clouds in that reflection, pale smudges of grey moving in the opposite direction, and where the wake met the bank, the water gave a tiny sigh and curled over in a lip of white that was barely foam. No other boat had passed this way since morning. The water was undisturbed except by this one hull, and so the reflections held their shape for a long time after the boat had left, healing slowly rather than shattering. A pair of swans had settled for the evening in a backwater some distance behind, and the wife had noted them as she passed, their white bodies glowing faintly in the dusk like crumpled paper, their heads already tucked under their wings for sleep. The tiller required no large movements, only a steady pressure that was less a push than a leaning, a transfer of weight from the left hand to the right hand that communicated itself down the ash arm and into the rudder, and from there into the water, and from there into the water, in a curve so subtle that no one watching from the bank would have noticed any change at all. The boat responded after a slight delay, the stern swinging slowly in the opposite direction from the tiller's deflection, obeying the ancient physics of lever and water, and then the wife would center the tiller again, and the boat would settle onto its new line with a faint tremor. These adjustments happened every minute or two, and between them, the boat ran straight and true, its trajectory held by the pull of the rope from the masthead and the gentle guidance of the deep-drafted hull in the center of the channel. The wife's gaze moved across the landscape in a habitual pattern, first to the towpath ahead, to check the horse's gait and the husband's posture, then to the canal directly ahead, to assess the reflections for any sign of shallows or floating debris, then to the sky above the western hedgerow where the light was fading fastest, then back to the towpath, then to the water, in a circuit that repeated itself as regularly as the horse's footfalls. She noted that the husband had not yet lit the bow lantern, which meant the light was still adequate. She noted that the horse was walking with the same long, sloping stride she always used at this hour. She noted that the surface of the canal had begun to lose its grey opacity and become slightly more transparent, so that she could just make out the sway of dark weed beneath the hull. All of these observations entered her awareness and left again without requiring any action, the same way a sleeper notes the wind outside without waking. The season's signs were everywhere in the hedgerow, if you have the slow attention to notice them. Late blackberries hung from the brambles in clusters of dark purple and black, their surfaces dulled by a fine bloom, and some had already begun to shrivel at the tips where the nights had cooled too quickly. The elder trees had shed most of their berries, leaving bare stalks that looked like tiny brown fingers, and the hawthorn haws had turned from green to a deep oxblood red that glowed against the dark leaves like little embers. The wife saw these things without cataloguing them, her mind storing the information for later use, when she would think about where to pick fruit, or whether the winter would be hard. For now the hedgerow was simply the hedgerow, and the berries were simply berries, and the boat moved past them at the same unchanging pace. The smell of the air changed by degrees as the canal carried the boat through different pockets of scent. Passing by a field where the hay had been cut and stacked, the wife breathed in the sweet, dusty smell of dried grass and clover, a smell that belonged to high summer but lingered into the early autumn when the stacks were still fresh. A little further on the canal ran close to a farmyard she could not see, and the air carried the clean, sharp scent of cow manure and fresh straw and wood smoke from a chimney somewhere behind the trees. Then the farmyard receded, and the scent of the canal itself returned. Green water, wet wood, the faint mineral tang of the coal in the hold, and always underneath everything, the clean living smell of the horse drifting back from the towpath. These shifts in the air were the only markers of progress, as if the canal were a string of different countries, each with its own atmosphere. The reflections on the water changed as the sky changed. When the wife first took the tiller that afternoon, the reflections had been hard and bright, the sun flashing off the ripples and the clouds sharp-edged in the glassy surface. Now, with the sun long gone and the sky a uniform soft grey, the reflections had softened until the water was no longer a mirror but a watercolor, the clouds and trees and hedges bleeding gently into one another without clear boundaries. The boat's own reflection rode alongside in the deeper water to one side, a dark twin that matched every detail of the hull and cabin, but lay slightly ahead or slightly behind depending on the angle of the fading light. A companion that had travelled with the boat since it was built and would travel with it until it was broken up. The wife's reflection was there too. A dark shape at the stern, her shawl a blur of grey, her hands invisible on the tiller. A moorhen appeared from the reeds on the right bank, its red and yellow bill the only spot of strong colour in the landscape, and it swam out into the canal with that odd jerking motion of its head, saw the boat bearing down, and darted back into the reeds with a small squawk and a splash. The wife adjusted the tiller a quarter-inch to the left, not to avoid the bird, but because the reeds indicated a shallow bank that would push the boat slightly off course, and the boat responded by sliding a few feet further into the centre of the channel. Behind the boat, the moorhen re-emerged and continued its evening forage, its dark body vanishing into the dark water, and soon the boat was far enough away that the bird was no longer visible. The wife did not look back. She was watching a bat that had appeared in the air above the water, its flight a rapid series of darting turns that wrote an invisible script against the grey sky. A second bat joined the first, then a third, their wings making no sound that human ears could detect, and the wife watched them for a moment before returning her gaze to the canal ahead. The depth of the canal was a constant quiet concern, not a worry, but a background awareness that never left her. She knew the sound that the rudder made when it touched the top of a mud bank, a soft thud transmitted up the tiller that felt like a knock on a door far inside the boat. She knew the way the boat would suddenly slow and yaw if the bow ran into a shoal, and she knew exactly how much pressure to apply to correct it before the situation became difficult. None of that happened now. The water was deep enough at the center, the bottom smooth and clear of obstacles, but still she monitored the telltale signs, the color of the water, the way the wake spread, the subtle changes in the tiller's hum. It was the same way she monitored the stove when it was lit, or the tow rope when it was under strain. A calm and continuous attending that required no effort precisely because it was so deeply practiced. Her hands on the tiller had become a single instrument after so many years. The left hand served as the anchor, the right hand as the fine adjuster, and between them they held the boat on its line as surely as a compass holds a ship. The skin of her palms was thicker than it had been when she first came to the boats as a young woman, and the constant friction of the wood had polished the tiller's grip to a glassy smoothness that fit the contours of her hands exactly. In the winter she would wrap the grip with a strip of flannel to keep the cold from numbing her fingers, but now in the mild autumn evening the bare wood was perfectly comfortable. She shifted her left hand a few inches forward to change the leverage, and the boat responded with a fractional course correction that was probably imaginary, and she shifted her hand back again. The cabin behind her was dark, its interior visible through the open doors as a black rectangle that smelled of cold stove and clean linen and the faint sweetness of stored oats for the horse. She knew every object in that cabin without needing to see it. The painted water can on its shelf, the lace-edged cloth over the bed, the brass clock that no longer worked but which she kept for its familiar face, the row of blue and white plates in the rack above the stove, the box of tea and the tin of sugar, and the small brown pot of mustard in the cupboard. These things were not thoughts, but presences, companions that travelled with her as surely as the horse and the husband, and the boat would not have felt like home without them arranged in their exact places. She did not turn to look at the cabin. She simply knew it was there. A small, warm cave, waiting for the end of the day. The sky had deepened now from pearl grey to a soft dove colour that held the last memory of daylight, like water holds the memory of warmth after the sun has gone. The clouds had thinned and stretched until they were almost invisible, a gauze of pale grey that would soon be indistinguishable from the darkness. The wife tilted her head back and looked straight up, seeing the first faint point of a star directly overhead, a pinprick of light that seemed to pulse very slightly as she watched. She lowered her head and looked again at the canal ahead, and the star was gone, hidden by the angle of her vision. She felt the familiar sense of the world narrowing as the light failed, the way the focus of her attention contracted from the wide landscape to the small circle of water lit by the lantern that she had not yet lit. The bats had multiplied while she was looking at the sky, a dozen of them now whirling and diving over the water, feeding on the small flies that rose from the surface at dusk. Their movements were so quick and erratic that it was impossible to follow a single bat for more than a second, and the wife let her eyes go soft, not tracking them, but simply aware of their presence as a flickering in the air, a kind of visual texture that belonged to the evening. The first bats of the night, she thought without thinking it, and the phrase passed through her mind and was gone. The boat continued forward, the rope continued its gentle pull, the water continued its soft sigh against the hull, and the tiller continued its faint vibration in her hands as the light faded from dove grey to a deeper shade that was almost, but not yet night. The sun had slipped below the horizon some minutes before, though it left behind a long farewell of muted brightness that seemed to cling to the undersides of the clouds, a soft radiance that came from nowhere in particular and cast no shadows on the water. The canal had begun its nightly transformation from a working thoroughfare into a quiet corridor of dark reflections, and the boat moved through this in-between hour with the same unhurried pace it had maintained all afternoon. Its hull parting water that was no longer brown or green, but a deep, lustrous black tinged at the very edges with the last pale memory of the day. The wife at the tiller could see this change most clearly in the way the surface of the canal had lost its transparency, so that the weed beneath was no longer visible, and the reflections on top had sharpened, the dark shapes of trees and hedges now printed on the water as clearly as if they had been painted there in ink. Ahead in the distance, a flight of locks stepped down the valley in a series of dark rectangles, their white-painted balance beams standing out against the gathering dusk like the bones of some large animal laid carefully in the grass. There were 5 locks in the flight, though from this distance only the top 2 were visible, the others hidden by a bend in the canal and a stand of old poplar trees whose leaves shivered constantly even when the air was still. The wife had worked these locks many times before and knew every detail of them. The slight leak in the top gate that sent a thin curtain of water down the stonework, the worn hollow in the brick coping where thousands of ropes had soared back and forth, the particular sound the ground paddles made when they were fully raised. None of this was present to her now as conscious thought, but simply as a layer of knowing that existed somewhere beneath the surface of her attention, the same way she knew the location of the tea-tin or the feel of the tiller in her hands. On the towpath the husband had seen the locks too, though he gave no outward sign of having noticed them. His stride remained the same, his hand remained on Dolly's neck, and the rope remained taut between the whipple tree and the mast. A lock flight at dusk meant that they would not work through it tonight, but would instead moor at the long lay-by just below the top chamber, a quiet spot where the bank had been reinforced with stone and a few iron rings had been set into the coping for tying up. That mooring was still more than a mile away, and the mile would take a full half-hour at the horse's steady walking pace, and so there was no need to think about it yet. The husband allowed the thought to arrive and depart without dwelling on it, and his boots continued to fall on the path in the same slow rhythm they had followed since early morning. Between the boat and the locks, the canal ran in a long, straight reach that the old boatman called the Mile Straight, a section so level and true that a boat could steer itself for minutes at a time, with barely a touch on the tiller. The banks here were low and grassy, without hedgerow or fence, and the fields on either side rolled away into the dusk, with no visible boundary between earth and sky, so that the boat seemed to be moving not on water, but through a great expanse of deepening twilight. A curlew called somewhere far off to the left, its voice a thin melodic note that rose and fell and rose again before dying away into the silence, and for a long moment after the call ended the silence itself seemed to have a texture, a density that pressed gently against the ears. The wife let her gaze drift across the open fields, where the last details of the day were disappearing into a uniform grey wash, and then she returned her attention to the water directly ahead of the boat. The water's colour had now shifted entirely, passing from greenish-brown through dark pewter to a black glass that held the pale sky in its surface, without any of the warmth that had been there even an hour before. Along the centre of the canal ran a single bright line, the reflection of the narrow band of lighter sky that still glowed above the western horizon, and this line wavered and broke as the boat passed through it, reforming behind the stern in a series of gentle curves that slowly straightened and became still again. The wife watched the line move ahead of the boat, a pale guide rope that led all the way to the dark mass of the lock gates, and she kept the bow exactly centered on it, the tiller making the smallest possible adjustments to maintain the alignment. The boat answered each adjustment with a slight swing that was barely perceptible, and the wake spread behind in a perfect V that caught the last light on its inner faces and then flattened into the general darkness. The towpath along the Mile Straight was narrower than elsewhere, beaten down to a single file track that left no room for the husband to walk beside the horse. He had moved behind her now, one hand still touching her flank, the other holding the rope free of the ground, and Dolly walked with her head slightly lowered, as if she too felt the openness of the landscape and the approach of night. The sound of her hooves changed again here, falling on earth that was softer and less compacted, and the regular beat acquired a muffled quality that made it seem further away than it was. The husband's breathing matched the horse's stride as it always did, and his thoughts had grown so quiet that they were barely thoughts at all, just a low awareness of the path and the rope, and the dark shape of the boat behind him. A little way ahead, the narrow towpath widened again at a small brick bridge that carried a farm track over the canal, its arch so low that a loaded boat could barely pass beneath it without scraping the cabin roof. The bridge was old, built when the canal was first cut 100 years before, and the bricks had weathered to a soft rose-brown color that was almost black in the growing dusk. A thick cushion of moss covered the lower courses of brickwork where the damp rose from the water, and from the keystone of the arch hung a single stalactite of lime, a tiny white finger that had grown drip by drip over many decades. The wife saw the bridge a long way off and noted the clearance with a practiced eye, knowing that the Mary Ann would just fit under it if she kept the boat exactly centered. She shifted the tiller a fraction to port, correcting a drift that had been so gradual she had not consciously noticed it, and the boat straightened its course as the dark mouth of the arch came nearer. Passing under the bridge, the boat entered a sudden pocket of denser darkness, the arch blocking what little light the sky still offered. The sound of the water changed instantly, the soft wash of the bow giving way to a low, hollow echo that seemed to come from all sides at once, and the horses' hooves above on the bridge deck made a sharp, ringing clop that echoed off the water and the brickwork together. The wife felt the change in air pressure, a slight coolness that pressed against her face, and she smelled the familiar scent of damp brick and old soot, and the clean green smell of the moss. Then the bow emerged on the far side, the cabin followed, and the stern deck slid out into the open air again, leaving the bridge behind. The husband and Dolly came down from the bridge deck on the far side and resumed their places on the towpath without any break in the rhythm, and the sound of the hooves returned to its former soft beat on the earth. The light on the far side of the bridge seemed dimmer than it had been on the near side, though this was mostly an illusion created by the moment of deeper darkness under the arch. The sky had continued its slow descent into night while the boat was passing beneath the bricks, and now only a thin band of pale grey remained along the western horizon, a line so narrow and faint that it might have been the last reflection of a light that was already gone. The stars had begun to appear in the darker part of the sky overhead, not many of them yet, just the brightest ones showing themselves one by one like distant lanterns being lit in some high window. The wife glanced up briefly, noting the position of the Plough constellation and the faint smudge of the Milky Way beginning to emerge, and then she returned her gaze to the water. The locks were closer now, close enough that she could make out the individual stones of the top chamber wall and the dark line of the balance beams against the grey grass. A small brick cottage stood beside the top lock, the lockkeeper's house, its windows already lit with a warm yellow glow that reflected in a broken chain on the black water. Smoke rose from its chimney, not the vertical column of the farmhouse earlier, but a drifting plume that leaned slightly to the east, with a breeze too high to feel at canal level. The wife saw the light in the windows and the smoke from the chimney, and filed both observations away without conscious thought, knowing that the lockkeeper was at home and that the locks were set in their evening position, ready for any boat that might arrive. No boat would arrive tonight except their own, and they would not work through until morning, and so the locks would rest in darkness for another night. The towpath between the bridge and the locks ran alongside a low embankment, where the canal had been built up above the level of the surrounding fields, and from here the wife could see over the hedgerow into the darkening countryside below. The fields lay in broad, flat rectangles separated by lines of darker hedge, and in one of them a small herd of cows moved slowly toward a gate, their shapes indistinct and strangely liquid in the failing light. Further off, a church tower rose above a cluster of trees, its stone a pale grey smudge against the sky, and from somewhere among the trees a dog barked 3 times and then stopped. The sound travelled across the fields as if through water, arriving at the boat already old and soft and half-dreamed. The wife listened to the echo of the bark die away, and then heard nothing but the familiar sounds of the boat and the horse and the water. The canal here was wider than before, forming a broad pool above the top lock that served as a waiting area for boats queuing to descend, though no boat had queued here in days, and the water was perfectly still except for the slow approach of the Mary Ann. The boat's wake spread outward in gentle circles that lapped against the stone coping of the lock entrance with a faint kissing sound, and beyond the entrance the lock chamber itself lay dark and silent, its water level with the upper reach, its gates closed and its paddles down. The wife steered slightly to the left, aiming for the long stone bank where the mooring rings were set, and the boat responded with a slow, graceful curve that brought it parallel to the bank and then alongside it with no more force than a hand placed on a shoulder. The husband had already slowed the horse and was walking her toward the grassy verge beyond the lock cottage, where she could graze and drink and rest for the night. The rope went slack and dropped into the water with a soft splash, and the boat drifted the last few feet on its own momentum, the wife leaning out with a mooring line in one hand. She stepped onto the bank, made the line fast to an iron ring, and then walks back to the stern to make that line fast too. The boat settled against the stone bank with a final gentle bump, its timbers creaking once and then falling silent. The day's travel was over, and the canal stretched away into the darkness behind them, empty and still, reflecting nothing now but the scattered stars and the single warm square of the lockkeeper's window. The visible world had grown so dim by now that the canal and the fields and the sky were all blending into a single deep shade of blue-grey, and the wife found her attention turning from the darkening landscape to the boat itself, to the small floating world whose every plank and rivet she knew as intimately as she knew her own breathing. The boat was not merely a vehicle. It was a home, a cargo carrier, a stable for the horse, and a repository of all the small, necessary things that made life on the water possible. And each part of it had its own quiet life that continued whether she watched it or not. She shifted her weight slightly on the stern deck, feeling the solid deck boards beneath her feet and the way they gave back a faint spring that came from the water pressing up against the hull. And she let her gaze move slowly forward over the length of the boat, taking in the dark shape of the cargo hold beneath its canvas covers. The hold occupied the middle third of the boat, a long rectangular space whose sides were formed by the inward-sloping hull planks and whose bottom rested on the heavy oak keel that ran the full length of the vessel. Over this open space the tarpaulins were stretched tight, their edges tucked down and lashed to the cleats along the gunwales with a series of neat hitches that the husband had checked at midday and would not need to check again until morning. The canvas was a deep brown color, almost black in the twilight, and it was stained in long vertical streaks where rainwater had run down and carried the fine coal dust with it, creating patterns that looked like the bars of some dark flowing script. The lashings creaked very softly as the boat settled against the bank, the hemp ropes adjusting to the new tension, and then they were silent. The wife ran her eye along the line of cleats and knots without moving from her place, satisfying herself that everything was as it should be, and then she let the matter rest. Beneath those tarpaulins, unseen but always present in the wife's awareness, lay the cargo, 17 tons of Best Midlands coal that had been loaded at the colliery basin 2 days before. The coal was not a uniform substance but a varied mass of different sizes and textures, from fine black slack that ran through the fingers like dry sand to hand-sized lumps that glittered with tiny facets when a light caught them, and in between were pieces of every intermediate size, all of them jumbled together so that they packed tightly and did not shift overmuch when the boat rocked. The wife could picture this cargo perfectly without seeing it, the way a baker can picture the loaves inside a closed oven, and she knew that the weight of it pressed down on the keel and kept the boat low in the water, the hull drawing a full 4 feet so that only the narrowest channels were too shallow. That weight was a comfort, a steadying force that made the boat ride smoothly through wind and wash, and when she walked forward along the gunwale, she could feel the solidity of it beneath her, the sense that the boat was not hollow but full, not empty, but carrying something heavy and real and valuable. The coal gave off a faint scent that rose through the gaps in the planking and through the weave of the canvas, a dry mineral smell like the smell of a just-extinguished candle or the dust in a summer attic, and it mingled with the other smells of the boat to create a single familiar aroma that the wife no longer noticed unless she made a point of doing so. When the tarpaulins were lifted for unloading, the coal would gleam in the light with a deep, oily blackness, and the men with their shovels would work steadily for an hour or more, reducing the neat heap to a scattering of dust and small chips that would be swept into the canal when no one was looking. But that unloading was still a day away, and for now the coal rested in the dark hold as it had rested since the loading, a silent passenger that asked for nothing and received nothing, settling only by tiny degrees as the vibration of the boat nudged the pieces a little closer together, filling the infinitesimal gaps and making the whole mass a fraction denser than it had been that morning. The wife became aware of the settling in the same way she became aware of the tiller's hum or the change in the air before rain, as a quiet fact that drifted through her thoughts without requiring attention. A small crunch had sounded from the hold an hour before, a sound like a boot stepping on gravel, and she had noted it and understood it. A lump of coal the size of a fist had found a new resting place, a quarter of an inch lower than its old one, and the whole pile had adjusted around it with a series of tiny movements too small to feel. Now the hold was silent again, the coal as still as the canal itself, and the wife let her thoughts move on to the other parts of the boat that she could see and touch and tend. The cabin at the stern was entered through a pair of low doors that stood open now, revealing a rectangle of deeper darkness within, and the wife stepped down from the deck and into that darkness with the ease of someone who could navigate the space blindfolded. The cabin was small, perhaps 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, and its ceiling was so low that she could not stand fully upright except in the center where the roof arched slightly. But it contained everything that 2 people needed for a life spent on the move. The walls were lined with painted boards that had been decorated many years before by a boat builder with a steady hand, their surfaces covered in patterns of roses and castles in the traditional style, red petals and green leaves against a cream background, small turreted castles with pennants flying, delicate scrollwork that curled around the edges of the cupboard doors. The paint was fading now, the reds turning to dusty pink and the greens to a soft sage, but the designs were still clear, and the wife still found them pleasing in a quiet, undemonstrative way. Against one wall stood the small cast-iron stove, a neat square box with a hinge door on the front and a flue pipe that rose through the roof, its surface blackened with stove polish and its brass fittings dulled to a soft gold. The stove was cold now, the fire having been allowed to die out during the afternoon when no one was in the cabin to tend it, but everything was ready for the evening lighting. A crumpled sheet of old newspaper lay in the grate, a handful of dry kindling sticks rested on top of it, and a small scuttle of coal sat on the floor beside the stove, its contents precisely the right size for starting a fire. The wife noted this readiness with a glance that required no further action. The fire would be lit when the boat was fully moored for the night and not before. Beside the stove, a small cupboard held the cooking pots, their bottoms blackened by years of flame, and a frying pan hung from a hook on the wall, its handle wrapped in a strip of worn cloth. The painted water cans stood on a narrow shelf above the bed, 3 of them arranged in a row like silent sentinels. The largest can, a 2-gallon vessel with a hinged lid and a brass tap near the base, had been decorated with a particularly fine castle scene, a turreted fortress on a hill, a winding river in the foreground, and a small boat painted in blue and yellow making its way upstream. The second can showed a bouquet of roses tied with a blue ribbon, the petals rendered in careful overlapping strokes, and the third was plain except for a band of green scrollwork around its middle. All 3 cans had been filled that morning at a water point near the morning mooring, and the wife could hear the water slosh very slightly inside them as the boat moved against the bank, a sound so familiar that it was almost a kind of silence. The cans were not merely decorative, they held the day's supply of drinking and washing water, and their presence on the shelf was a comfort that spoke of order and provision and the absence of thirst. The lace-edged shelf that ran along the opposite wall was perhaps the most delicate thing on the boat, a strip of white cloth that had been crocheted by the wife herself during long evenings in the cabin, its pattern a repeating series of diamond shapes and tiny loops. The lace hung down over the edge of the shelf by 3 inches, moving faintly in the draught from the open doors, and on the shelf itself rested a row of small objects, a china dog with a chipped ear, a pair of brass candlesticks that had been polished so many times they were thin as paper, a small wooden box that held a needle and thread, and a few spare buttons. These things had no practical function, but they had been on the shelf for so long that their presence was a kind of necessity, the way a room without a clock feels not quite like a room. The wife touched the china dog once with the tip of her finger as she passed, a gesture so habitual that she did not notice herself doing it, and then she moved on to check the bed. The bed was built into the cabin wall opposite the stove, a narrow rectangle just wide enough for 2 people to lie side by side if they did not move. It was made up with plain white linen, a bottom sheet tucked tightly under the thin straw mattress, a top sheet folded back with a strip of blanket showing, and 2 pillows in white pillowcases that had been ironed with the flat iron at the last laundry stop. The linen smelled of soap and fresh air, and the faint clean scent of the lavender sachet the wife kept in the bedding box. She smoothed the top sheet with one hand, feeling the cool smoothness of the cotton, and then she straightened the pillowcases so that their open ends faced away from the door. The bed was ready for the night, as it always was by this hour, and the thought of it waiting in the dark cabin brought a quiet sense of completion that was too deep to be called satisfaction. Above the bed a small shelf held a very few books, their covers worn and their pages softened by damp air, a Bible that had belonged to the wife's mother, a copy of The Pilgrim's Progress with its spine missing, and a thin volume of collected hymns that she knew by heart and no longer needed to read. Beside the books lay a folded map of the Grand Union Canal, printed on heavy paper that had been reinforced with linen at the folds, its surface marked here and there with small pencil notes in the husband's handwriting, the names of good moorings, the distances between locks, the location of the coal wharf at Cow Roast. The wife knew every word on that map without looking at it, and she knew the canal itself better than the map could ever show. But still she kept it on the shelf, and still she unfolded it sometimes on winter evenings when the boat was moored and the stove was lit, and she wanted to trace the route of the next day's journey with her finger. The floor of the cabin was made of bare boards that had been scrubbed so many times they were pale grey and soft to the tread, and a small rag rug lay in the centre of the open space, its stripes of blue and brown faded almost to the same colour. The wife's shoes had left a series of faint damp prints on the boards, and these would dry within minutes of the stove being lit, leaving no trace. She stood for a moment in the centre of the cabin, her head slightly bent to clear the ceiling, and she listened to the quiet of the space around her, the faint creak of the hull against the stone bank, the distant sound of the horse cropping grass, somewhere beyond the lock cottage, the low murmur of the husband's voice as he spoke to the animal, or to himself. The cabin was ready. The cargo was secure, the boat was still, and the last of the daylight was now entirely gone from the sky beyond the open doors. The wife did not think about these things in words, not exactly. Her mind moved among them the way a hand moves among familiar objects on a dark shelf, touching one thing and then another, confirming that all was in its place without needing to name what it found. The hold was full and the covers were tight, the stove was laid and the water cans were full, the bed was smooth and the lace was clean, and somewhere beyond the cabin the husband was settling the horse and the night was settling over the canal, and the boat was settling against the bank with a series of small, soft adjustments that were more like breathing than moving. All of the day's small, interconnected tasks had been seen to, and what remained was only the lighting of the fire, and the eating of the supper, and the slow winding down of consciousness into sleep. The wife turned toward the doors and stepped back up onto the stern deck, where the air was cool and the stars had multiplied, and the canal lay black and silent under the weight of the autumn night. With the full darkness now settled over the canal like a blanket drawn up to the horizon, the world contracted from a panorama of shapes and distances into a close sphere of sounds, each one distinct and separate in the still evening air. The wife had returned to her place on the stern deck after checking the cabin, that the boat was now securely moored and the tiller was lashed in its center position with a loop of cord, and she stood with her hands resting on the cabin roof, her head slightly tilted in the attitude of someone who is listening rather than watching. The visual world had become almost irrelevant. The canal was a black mirror, the fields were a black expanse, and the sky was a black dome scattered with 1,000 small, cold lights that gave no illumination to the earth below. What remained was sound, and in the absence of sight the ear became the primary organ of attention, receiving each noise as it arrived and holding it for a moment before releasing it into the silence that followed. The soft rhythmic swish of the boat parting the water had ceased when the boat came to rest, but other water sounds had risen to take its place. There was the faint lapping of tiny wavelets against the stone bank, a sound so delicate it was more like the clicking of small tongues than the splash of water, produced by the residual movement of the canal as the boat's wake finally spent itself against the distant banks and sent back its almost imperceptible echoes. There was the slow drip of water from the boat's hull, where the wet planks dried above the waterline, each drop falling back into the canal with a small liquid note that was unique in pitch and duration, never quite the same twice. And there was the deeper, almost subaudible gurgle of the canal itself, the sound of water moving through the narrow gaps in the lock gates 100 yards away, a continuous low murmur that had been present all along but was only noticeable now that every other sound had diminished. From the towpath beyond the lock cottage came the muffled rhythmic sound of the horse cropping grass, a steady rip and chew that went on for perhaps a minute, and then paused while Dolly lifted her head to listen to something only she could hear, then resumed with the same unhurried pace. The sound of grazing was a comfort, a sign that the horse was settled and content, and that the day's labor was truly over, and the wife let it register in the back of her awareness without focusing on it. Somewhere closer, just out of sight behind the cabin, the husband was moving about in the dark, his boots making small sounds on the stone bank as he checked the mooring lines one last time, and the occasional soft clink of a buckle or the brush of a sleeve against a coat reached the wife's ears with a clarity that seemed heightened by the darkness. The husband's footsteps stilled, and for a long moment there was no human sound at all. Then from the fields to the east came the low, resonant call of a cow, a single long note that began deep in the animal's chest and rose slowly before cutting off, and this call was answered a few seconds later by another cow somewhere further away. And then the silence returned. The cattle were settling for the night in whatever meadow they occupied, their great bodies lying down one by one on the cool grass, and the wife could picture this without seeing it, the same way she could picture the horse in the dark, and the husband on the bank, and the boat at rest. A blackbird gave its final alarm call of the evening from the hedge behind the lock cottage, a sharp, percussive note that cut through the quiet and then vanished. And after it, the night birds began their own smaller, softer conversations. The thin, sweet piping of a robin from the alders, the distant tremolo of an owl waking somewhere in the poplar stand. The wife's own breathing had slowed to match the stillness of the boat. Each inhalation drawing the cool night air deep into her lungs, and each exhalation releasing it in a slow, quiet stream that she could hear as a faint whisper in her own ears. She was aware of her breath as she had not been during the day when the movement of the boat and the demands of the tiller had occupied her attention, and now in the stillness it seemed to her that her breathing had become part of the boat's own rhythm, the slow rise and fall of her chest matching the slow rise and fall of the hull on the invisible currents of the canal. The sensation was not strange but familiar, a reminder that she and the boat had been together for so long that the boundaries between them had grown thin. From somewhere up the canal, perhaps half a mile distant, came the thin, carrying sound of a dog barking. 3 short barks, then a pause, then 2 more. The sound travelled over the water with a clarity that would have been impossible during the day, the flat surface of the canal acting as a conduit for the noise, and the wife could tell by its direction that it came from a farm she knew, a place where a collie kept watch over a flock of sheep in a field near the towpath. She had seen that dog many times, a black and white animal with one blue eye, and she pictured it now standing at its gate and barking at nothing in particular, the way farm dogs do in the evening when the world grows quiet and they feel the need to remind themselves of their own presence. The barking stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the silence that followed seemed deeper, by contrast, a silence that was not empty but full, as if the space left by the sound had been filled by something denser than air. The silence between sounds was as much a part of the evening as the sounds themselves. It stretched out for minutes at a time, broken only by the distant, barely audible jingle of the horse's harness as she shifted her weight from one foot to another, or by the small wet sound of a fish rising to the surface somewhere out in the darkness and taking a floating insect with a soft, circular sip. During these long intervals the wife's mind drifted without direction, touching on nothing in particular, and she found herself attending to the quality of the quiet itself, the way it seemed to have a texture that varied from moment to moment. Sometimes it was a soft, woolly quiet that pressed gently against the ears. Sometimes it was a thin, glassy quiet that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest sound. And sometimes it was a deep, velvety quiet that seemed to extend outward forever in all directions. The husband had finished his tasks on the bank and was now walking slowly back toward the boat, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the limestone gravel of the path. The wife could track his approach by the sound alone, hearing the way the gravel gave way to the softer thud of trodden earth, and then to the hollow ring of the stone coping as he stepped onto the bank beside the boat. He did not speak, and neither did she, but she could feel his presence as a change in the air, a slight warmth and the smell of wool and horse and outdoor labor that arrived a moment before he did. He stood beside her on the bank for a minute, his face a pale oval in the darkness, and then he turned away again and walked toward the lock cottage, where the warm yellow light still shone from the window and the smoke still drifted from the chimney. The sound of the lock-keeper's door opening and closing reached the wife as a brief rectangular bloom of voices, a man's low greeting, and the husband's reply, and then the door closed, and the voices were gone, and the evening sounds resumed their quiet dominion. The wife knew without being told that her husband had gone to inform the lock-keeper of their presence, and to arrange for the morning passage, though the lock-keeper would already know, and the arrangement was less an arrangement than a formality. A courtesy extended between people who shared the canal as their home. The lock-keeper would offer a cup of tea, and the husband would accept it, and the two men would stand in the small warm kitchen for a few minutes exchanging quiet words about water levels and coal prices and the weather to come. The wife was not part of this ritual, and had no wish to be. Her own rituals were here on the boat, in the dark and the quiet. She turned her attention back to the water sounds, which had become so familiar over the years that she could distinguish a dozen different notes in what might have seemed to a stranger like an undifferentiated murmur. There was the soft, regular slap of the water against the stone bank as the boat rocked, a sound that had a definite rhythm, perhaps once every 3 seconds. There was the higher, thinner trickle of water passing through the small leak in the top lock gate, a sound that never stopped and never varied. There was the occasional deeper splash of a water vole entering the canal from its hole in the bank, followed by the faint rustling of reeds as the animals swam away into the darkness. And there was, very far off, the sound of running water where a stream passed under the canal in a culvert, a distant rushing that was more a feeling than a sound, a vibration in the air that the wife sensed rather than heard. The bats had returned, or perhaps these were different bats, and their high, rapid clicking calls were just at the edge of audible range, a series of tiny ticking sounds that came from above and all around as the animals hunted over the water. The wife could not see them in the darkness, but she knew their flight patterns by heart, the steep dives, the sudden turns, the way they dipped to the water's surface to drink in mid-flight. Their presence was a sign that the night was fully here and that the daytime creatures had all retired, the swallows to their nests under the eaves of the lock cottage, the moorhens to their reed beds, the swans to their backwater with their heads still tucked under their wings. The bats owned the air now, and the owls would own it a little later, and the wife was merely a quiet observer standing on the deck of her boat and listening to the world turn slowly toward midnight. A cool puff of air moved across the canal, carrying with it the clean green scent of watermint, growing somewhere on the far bank, a smell that arrived suddenly and then faded just as suddenly, leaving behind the usual damp mineral smell of the canal and the faint, pleasant odor of coal dust. The wife breathed in the watermint while it was there, appreciating it the way she appreciated all the small passing gifts of the canal, and then she breathed out and let it go. The air was distinctly cooler now than it had been even half an hour before, and she drew her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, a gesture so automatic that she was not aware of making it. The wool of the shawl was soft against her neck, and she tucked the ends under her arms to hold it in place. The husband emerged from the lock cottage, and the door opened and closed again with its brief bloom of lamplight, and she heard his boots on the stone and then on the gravel and then on the earth of the towpath as he came back toward the boat. The horse lifted her head at his approach and gave a low, soft whicker, to which the husband replied with a murmur too low for the wife to catch. She heard him check the horse's tether and pour water into the bucket from the can beside the cottage, and then she heard him walk the last few yards to the boat and step onto the stern deck beside her. They stood together for a moment in the dark, not speaking, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of two people who have spent so many evenings together that speech has become unnecessary. The wife felt the slight dip of the deck as her husband went into the cabin, and a moment later she heard the scratch of a match and saw the small, brief flare of light as he lit the stove. The flame caught the kindling with a soft rushing sound, and the first glow of firelight appeared in the cabin doorway, a warm orange flicker that reflected on the black water beside the boat and sent a few stray sparks up the flue to vanish in the darkness above. The smell of wood smoke joined the other smells of the evening, sharp and clean at first, then softening as the kindling burned down and the coal began to catch. The wife remained on the deck a little longer, listening to the water sounds and the distant owl and the quiet crackle of the fire, aware of nothing in particular, except the slow, deep peace of the canal at night. The boat lay still against the stone bank below the top lock, its mooring lines creaking faintly as the hull rose and fell on a breath of current too slight to be felt. And in the deep quiet that followed the lighting of the cabin stove, the wife found her gaze drawn forward to the dark shapes of the lock flight stair stepping down the valley. Though the night was fully upon the canal now, a thin sliver of moon had risen above the poplar trees, casting a light so faint it was more a silver suggestion than an illumination, and in that ghostly half-light the rectangular stone chambers of the locks revealed themselves, not as detailed structures, but as a series of darker rectangles against the grey-black grass, their edges softened by shadow and their depths entirely hidden. The wife could see the top gate most clearly, its two great leaves of oak planking meeting an a pointed mitre that faced upstream, and she could see the balance beams angling out from either side like long wooden arms reaching toward the towpath, their white paint reduced by the moonlight to a pale, unearthly grey. The lock flight consisted of 5 chambers in total, each one lower than the one above it by exactly 7 feet and 6 inches, a measurement that had been determined by the canal engineers a century before and had never changed. The wife knew that measurement in her bones the same way she knew the width of the narrowboat or the depth of the water at every point along the Grand Union, and she could recite the full list of rise and fall for every flight between Braunston and Brentford if anyone had asked. Though no one ever did. The top chamber where her boat now waited was the shallowest of the 5 in practice, its water level with the upper reach so that a boat could enter without any drop, and the chamber below it was the one that would require the first careful opening of paddles to lower the water and the boat together down to the next level. From where the wife stood, she could see only the topmost gate and the dark hollow of the first chamber, the remaining 4 chambers hidden by the angle of the slope and the intervening walls. But she could picture them perfectly, each one identical to the others in its essential construction. The mechanics of a canal lock are simple enough to be understood by a child, yet they have governed the movement of boats across the English Midlands for more than 100 years without altering in any fundamental way. A lock is nothing more than a chamber with a gate at each end, each gate holding back a different level of water, and the chamber itself can be filled or emptied by means of small sliding doors called paddles that cover openings in the gates or in the walls of the chamber. When the top paddles are opened, water from the upper level pours into the chamber through narrow culverts built into the masonry, and the boat rises or stays level, depending on which gate is open. When the bottom paddles are opened, water drains out of the chamber into the lower level, and the boat descends. The gates themselves are made of heavy oak beams, each leaf tapering to a point where they meet, and the pressure of the water holds them tightly shut so that no latch is needed. Only the simple physics of water seeking its own level. The wife had worked these locks more times than she could count, and the sequence of actions required to pass a boat through a lock had become so deeply ingrained that her hands could perform them without her mind needing to direct them. She would steer the boat into the open chamber while the husband closed the top gate behind her. Then she would loop a rope around a bollard on the lock side to hold the boat steady while he walked forward to the bottom gates and wound the paddle gear to let the water out. The water would begin to fall, slowly at first and then faster, and the boat would descend with it, the stone walls rising higher and higher above the gunwale until they blocked out the sky, and all the while the wife would keep the rope in her hand, paying it out or taking it in by small increments to keep the boat from drifting into the wall or the gate. When the water in the chamber had fallen to the level of the lower reach, the bottom gates would swing open and the boat would glide out into the next pound, and the whole process would begin again at the next lock. None of this would happen until morning, and the wife felt no urge to hurry toward it. The locks in the darkness were merely shapes, a geography of stone and wood that had been there before she was born and would remain long after she was gone, and she regarded them now with the same quiet attention she might give to a sleeping animal or a closed door. The moon continued its slow climb, and as it rose the half-light strengthened just enough to reveal the details that had been hidden before, the coping stones along the top of the lock wall, their edges rounded by a century of ropes and feet, the dark slots of the ground paddle culverts marked by a faint sheen of moisture, the iron rack of the paddle gear standing up from the balance beam like a skeletal hand. The wife saw all of this without naming it, letting the shapes register in her mind as a painter might register a familiar landscape, and then she let her attention move on to the quiet sounds that accompanied the locks even in their resting state. Water sounds were everywhere at a lock flight, even when no boat was passing through. The top gate leaked at the mitre, as all old gates leak, and a thin curtain of water slid down the inner face of the planking with a soft, continuous hiss that was almost a whisper. From somewhere inside the masonry, a hidden culvert gurgled, its throat half choked with leaves and twigs that had washed in during the last rain, and the water that emerged from it fell into the chamber below with a hollow, musical plunking that repeated at irregular intervals. The bottom gates, far below and out of sight, dripped and trickled in their own private patterns, and the whole flight gave off a faint, pervasive sound of running water that was as much a part of the night as the owl's call or the rustle of bats, a sound so constant that its absence would have been more startling than its presence. The wife had fallen asleep to that sound on 100 different nights in 100 different moorings, and it had become for her what the sound of the sea is for a fisherman or the sound of wind in the leaves. For a forester, the baseline of silence against which all other sounds were measured. The moon now was high enough to cast a thin silver line along the center of the canal above the lock, a line that wavered and broke where the current from the leak disturbed the surface, and the wife followed that line with her eyes from the boat's bow all the way to the dark mass of the top gate. The water in the pound was perfectly still otherwise, a black mirror that held the moon's reflection as a small cold coin of light that trembled very slightly but never moved from its place. On the far bank the reeds stood up in a black fringe, their seed heads motionless, and beyond them the meadow rolled away into a darkness so complete that the grazing cattle were invisible, though the wife could still hear the occasional low, soft breath of one of them shifting its weight on the grass. The lock chamber itself was a rectangle of absolute blackness, its water surface invisible from this angle, and the wife knew that as she walked up to the edge and looked down, she would see nothing but her own faint reflection, looking back at her from the dark water, a pale oval face floating on the void. The paddle gear on the balance beam caught the moonlight on its iron teeth, a row of small cold gleams that marked the position of the rack and the pinion, and the wife could trace in her mind the motion of winding that gear, the iron handle inserted into the square socket, the turn of the wrist that engaged the cogs, the slow, heavy rotation that lifted the oak paddle from its seat and allowed the water to rush through the culvert with a sudden roar. The sound of water pouring into or out of a lock chamber was one of the few loud sounds on the canal, a deep, full-throated roar that drowned out all other noise, and after so many years of hearing it, the wife had learned to judge the opening of the paddle by the note of that roar, knowing when it was safe to open it further, and when it must be closed to avoid a surge that would bang the boat against the wall. All of this knowledge lay dormant in her now, not needed but present, like the knowledge of how to swim or how to light a fire, waiting for the moment when the day would begin and her hands would resume their work. The husband had returned from the lock cottage and was now sitting on the cabin roof with his back against the slide, his shape a darker darkness against the dark wood. And though he said nothing, the wife could feel his attention also turned toward the locks, his thoughts perhaps running along the same quiet grooves as her own. They had worked this flight together so many times that the division of labor between them was as fixed as the path of the canal itself. She would stay with the boat in the chamber while he walked ahead to set the next lock, and by the time she brought the boat out of one chamber, he would have the next one ready and waiting, the bottom gates open and the rope ready to catch. The rhythm of it was as steady as the horse's walk on the towpath, a sequence of actions that began at the top of the flight and ended at the bottom without any need for hurry or discussion. And the wife could feel that rhythm now as a kind of quiet anticipation, a readiness that was not impatience, but simply the knowledge that the morning would come, and the locks would be there, and the work would begin again. The half-light shifted slightly as the moon crossed behind a thin veil of cloud, and for a moment the lock gates and the balance beams and the coping stones all softened further, losing their edges and becoming almost indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness. Then the cloud passed, and the moon emerged again, and the shapes reassembled themselves in their places as if they had never wavered. The wife watched this small transformation without comment, the same way she watched the passing of a cloud shadow across a field on a summer afternoon, and then she returned her attention to the gentle, repetitive sounds of the canal at night. The lock chambers stood waiting in their slow order, full of dark water and silence, and the boat lay still against the bank, and the moon climbed higher, and the wife let her thoughts drift without direction through the quiet mechanics of stone and water and wood. The husband walked in a pocket of near darkness that was defined less by what he could see than by what he could feel, the texture of the earth transmitting itself upward through the worn soles of his boots, the steady pull of the hemp rope angled across his left shoulder and cutting a familiar groove into the wool of his jacket, the faint warmth of the horse's body radiating from the great dark shape that moved just ahead of him on the narrow path. His world had shrunk as the light failed, contracting from the wide views of afternoon to a small circle of immediate sensation that extended no further than his outstretched hand. This narrowing was not a loss but a simplification, a reduction of the day's complexity to the few essential things that remained: the step, the breath, the rope, the path, the horse. He had walked this way for so many years that the darkness was not an obstacle, but a kind of companion, a quiet presence that walked beside him and asked for nothing. The heavy woolen jacket that covered his shoulders and chest had been made for him by a tailor in Broadston 7 winters before, cut from a dense grey tweed that had softened with age until the fibres lay flat and smooth under his fingers. The jacket was double-breasted, with large horn buttons that were each a slightly different shade of brown, having been replaced at different times as they fell off or cracked, and the buttonholes were bound with a thin leather strip that had darkened to the colour of old saddle. Under the jacket he wore a waistcoat of plain brown serge with a pocket on the left side that held a tin of lucifer matches wrapped in oilcloth, and under the waistcoat a shirt of coarse cotton that had once been white but was now a soft ivory from countless washings in canal water and sunlight. His trousers were of heavy moleskin tied below the knee with lengths of cotton cord that had been knotted so many times they no longer loosened, and this cord kept the cloth from catching on the tow rope or brushing against the wet grass of the bank. His boots were the boots of a man who walked 20 miles a day, their leather uppers moulded to the exact shape of his feet by years of alternate wetting and drying. The toe caps dark and polished by contact with towpath grass, the soles layered with fresh leather at a cobbler's in Leighton Buzzard so many times that the original sole was only a memory deep within the layers. On his head he wore a felt hat with a narrow brim, its crown dented in 3 places by the habit of his fingers pinching it on and off, and the brim cast a shadow that obscured his eyes and left his face a pale blur from the cheekbones down. The hat was a dark brown colour that had been black when it was new, and the band inside the brim was stained with sweat in a pattern that exactly matched the shape of his forehead. He did not think about the hat. It was simply there, as much a part of his walking self as his boots or his breath. When he turned his head slightly to look back at the boat, the brim of the hat remained level, and the dark shape of the boat appeared in the corner of his vision, with the wife's figure still outlined against the last faint glow of the western sky. Those glances backward occurred every few hundred yards without conscious scheduling, a habit so deeply ingrained that his neck muscles began to turn before his mind registered the impulse. Each glance confirmed the same small set of facts. The boat was still centered in the canal, the tiller was still steady in the wife's hand, the lantern on its hook remained unlit because there was still enough sky glow to steer by. The wife's outline was sharp against that glow, her shawl a faint grey patch, her posture exactly as it had been an hour before, and would remain for another half-hour until the true darkness fell and the lantern was lit. The husband saw all of this in a single unhurried intake of information, and then his head turned back to the path ahead, and the information faded from his conscious thought, leaving only the quiet reassurance that all was well. The towpath here ran through a stretch of open country, where the fields lay flat and broad on either hand, the pasture on the left sloping gently upward to a low ridge, and the meadow on the right dropping toward a distant line of willows that marked the course of a small stream. The grass on both sides had been cut for hay some weeks before, and the stubble was short and even, giving off a dry, sweet scent that reached the husband's nose in faint waves whenever the air moved. There were no hedges close to the path along this section, only a low wire fence on the pasture side and a shallow drainage ditch on the canal side that was mostly dry now after a rainless September. The openness of the landscape meant that the wind could reach him without obstruction. A light breeze that came from the northwest and carried the cool, clean smell of distant rain that might fall tomorrow or might not fall at all. The husband's pace never altered. His right foot came down, his weight shifted forward, his left foot came down, and the rope pulled against his shoulder with a gentle, rhythmic pressure that was as regular as a heartbeat. The pressure was not a strain, the boat was well balanced, and the horse took most of the load, leaving only a small fraction of the pull for the man to bear, enough to remind him that he was part of the system, but not enough to tie him. Over the years, a pad of thickened skin had formed on the top of his shoulder where the rope rested, and the muscle beneath had grown accustomed to the weight, so that he no longer noticed it, except at the very end of a long day, and even then only as a faint warmth that spread down his arm and into his back. The rope itself was smooth and cool, its hempen strands worn to a silky finish by constant handling, and it made a soft sound as it stretched and relaxed with each step, a sound like someone breathing slowly in the next room. Familiar landmarks passed him in the darkness without requiring acknowledgement, and yet his mind registered each one as it came and went. A quiet inventory of the known world. A lone oak tree stood in the middle of the pasture field, its shape unmistakable even against the dark sky, a great spreading crown of branches that had sheltered generations of cattle from the summer sun. The husband had walked past that oak 1,000 times and knew that its trunk leaned slightly to the east, and that a lightning scar ran down its southern face in a long, twisted seam. A wooden stile crossed the wire fence at the edge of the pasture, its 2 steps worn to a hollow curve by the passage of farm boots, and the husband noted the pale glimmer of its weathered wood without turning his head. A broken gate post lay half buried in the grass just beyond the stile, its top splintered and its iron hinges rusted to a deep orange brown, a remnant of some forgotten repair that had never been completed. These things were not interesting in themselves, but they were the markers of his journey, the beads on a string that measured the miles, and he passed them with the same quiet recognition with which he might pass the houses on his own street. The horse walked ahead of him, her hind quarters a great dark shape that blocked out a portion of the darker sky, and the husband's eyes rested on that shape without focusing on it, letting it fill his vision in the same way the path filled his feet. Dolly's tail swished occasionally, a slow sweep that brushed against the husband's sleeve when she angled it to the left, and the sound of that swish was a soft, rhythmic shushing that joined the other small sounds of the evening. The harness brass gave a single small jingle when the horse adjusted her stride to avoid a loose stone, and then the jingle faded and the rhythm resumed. The husband's own breathing had fallen into phase with the horse's footsteps, exhaling on every 4th hoofbeat, and this pattern had become so automatic that he was not aware of it unless some small interruption broke the sequence. A stumble, a pause, the need to release the rope and pass it under a low bridge or through a narrow gap. The meditative quality of long-distance towing was something the husband had never tried to explain to anyone, partly because no one had ever asked, and partly because he lacked the words for it, even if they had. It was not thinking in the ordinary sense, not the kind of mental activity that involved words or pictures or chains of reasoning. It was more like the slowing of a wheel that had been turning all day, the gradual unwinding of tension until the mind no longer reached forward into the future or backward into the past, but simply rested in the present moment, attending to the step and the breath and the rope and the horse and the path without naming any of them. In this state, which he entered without trying and left without noticing, the miles passed not as measurable distances, but as a seamless flow of sensation, and he arrived at the evening mooring with the sense that no time had passed at all since the morning. His thoughts, if they could be called thoughts, moved in a slow current that carried small fragments of awareness to the surface and then submerged them again. He noticed the way the texture of the path changed from packed earth to loose gravel and back again, each transition announced by a slight change in the sound of his boots and the horse's hooves. He noticed the way the air cooled as the path dipped into a shallow hollow, and then warmed again as it rose onto a slight embankment. A difference of only a few degrees, but enough to register on his cheeks. He noticed the way the darkness was not uniform but varied in density, deeper under the trees and thinner over the open water, a texture of blackness that he read without conscious effort. All of these small perceptions drifted through him like leaves on a stream, appearing and disappearing without leaving any trace. The rope across his shoulder was a living thing, a line of communication that connected him to the boat and the wife and the cargo all at once. When the boat drifted slightly out of the center of the channel, the rope would tighten or slacken by a tiny degree, and the husband would feel this change before he saw it, adjusting his own position on the path by a step to the left or right to compensate. When the boat passed over a shallow spot where the hull dragged briefly on the mud, the rope would give a single, soft tug that traveled up through the horse's harness and into the husband's shoulder, a signal that required no response because the boat had already corrected itself. And when the wife made one of her small adjustments to the tiller, the boat would swing by a fraction and the rope would transmit that swing as a slight sideways pull that lasted only a second and then vanished. The husband read all of these signals in the same way he read the path under his feet, without thinking about them, his body responding before his mind could form a conscious instruction. The landscape continued to unroll around him in the slow panoramic way of the canal, though the darkness had now reduced it to a series of dark masses and lighter spaces. The pasture on the left was a broad expanse of grey-black that stretched away to a low ridge where the sky began, and the meadow on the right was a similar expanse broken only by the line of the ditch and the faint shimmer of the canal's surface. The canal itself was now completely dark, a ribbon of blackness that reflected nothing except the occasional glint of a star when the surface was perfectly still, and the husband could no longer see the boat's wake or the ripples at the bow. He navigated, not by sight, but by the feel of the path and the pull of the rope, his feet finding the way, while his eyes rested on the dark shape of the horse and the slightly less dark shape of the sky. He passed the lone oak tree without looking at it, though his body registered its presence as a slight change in the air, a shelter from the breeze that lasted for a few steps and then was gone. He passed the wooden stile and the broken gatepost, both now invisible in the darkness, but present in his awareness as a sense of having arrived at a known point and then left it behind. He passed a small copse of ash trees that leaned out over the canal, their leaves making a soft, dry rustle, even though the breeze was barely strong enough to stir them, and the sound accompanied him for 30 paces and then fell away behind. The path curved slightly to the left, following the contour of the land, and the husband curved with it, his body leaning into the turn as naturally as the boat would lean when it reached the same curve a minute later. His mind had grown very quiet now, the last residue of the day's thoughts having drained away into the rhythm of walking. The words that had passed through his mind earlier in the afternoon, the small memories and anticipations and fragments of conversations, had all fallen away, leaving nothing but the simple sensation of movement through the cool, dark air. The step, the breath, the rope, the horse. Step, breath, rope, horse. Step, breath, rope, horse. The pattern repeated itself without variation, a kind of walking sleep that was not sleep but something deeper than waking, a state in which the boundary between the self and the world grew so thin that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The husband had known this state since he was a boy, walking behind his father's boat on a different canal in a different part of the country, and he had never given it a name because it did not need one. A nightjar called from somewhere in the meadow, its strange churring note rising and falling in a long, unbroken stream of sound, and the husband heard it as he heard everything else, with a quiet attention that asked no questions and expected no answers. The sound continued for perhaps a minute, and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and the silence that followed was filled with the soft, steady rhythm of hooves and breath and the distant trickle of water somewhere out in the dark. The husband walked on, and the horse walked on, and the boat followed behind them on the invisible thread of the rope, and the night deepened around them all like water slowly filling a lock chamber, quiet and patient and complete. The last usable light had now drained so completely from the sky that the wife could no longer distinguish the line where the water ended and the bank began, and it was this absence of any remaining grayness rather than any conscious decision that told her the moment had come to light the lantern. She did not hurry toward the task, but instead let her hands begin it in their own time, the right hand leaving the tiller and moving to the small shelf set into the cabin bulkhead where the paraffin lantern waited on its hook, while the left hand kept the boat steady with a pressure that had become automatic. The lantern was a simple brass affair with a clear glass chimney protected by a wire cage that had been bent and repaired several times, its metal body warm from the residual heat of the day, its wick trimmed only that morning to a neat, flat top that would burn cleanly without smoking. The wife lifted it from its hook with the care of someone handling a familiar but fragile object, her fingers finding the small knob that controlled the wick height and giving it a quarter turn to raise the charred tip into position for lighting. The matches were kept in a small tin box with a ridged striker surface on the lid, and this box lived in the pocket of her apron where she could reach it without looking, its contents protected from damp by a folded scrap of oiled silk that rustled softly as she opened it. She removed a single lucifer match, its stem of pale wood smelling faintly of sulphur even before it was struck, and she closed the tin one-handed and returned it to her pocket, while her other hand held the lantern steady against the gentle rock of the boat. The match she struck against the roughened iron striker on the cabin bulkhead, a single firm stroke that produced a sudden flare of white light and the sharp, familiar smell of ignition, and she cupped her free hand around the flame with a practiced curve of her palm that shielded it from the faint breeze while guiding it toward the exposed wick. The flame touched the wick, and the wick caught with a small soft puff of yellow light that wavered for a moment and then steadied, growing stronger as the paraffin soaked into the fibers and began to burn in earnest. The glass chimney was cool from the evening air, its surface faintly clouded with a residue of previous burnings that gave the emerging light a soft, diffused quality, and the wife fitted it carefully over the flame with the steady hands of someone who had performed this action 1,000 times. The light strengthened as the chimney settled into its brass collar, the yellow glow deepening to a warm gold that pushed back the darkness by a radius of perhaps 6 feet, no more, but enough to illuminate the deck where she stood and the smooth dark surface of the water immediately beside the boat. She adjusted the wick height with a tiny turn of the knob, watching the flame through the glass until it reached the point where it burned steadily without flickering or smoking, a neat teardrop of light that was exactly the color of honey held up to the sun. The lantern then went back onto its hook, its bail handle settling into the worn groove with a soft click, and the small circle of light became a fixed presence at her side, a pool of warmth that traveled with her as the boat moved forward. The light cast by the lantern was not strong enough to reach the bank or the towpath, but it did reach the water, and on the black surface of the canal, it scattered into a broken chain of gold that trembled with every tiny ripple. The wife saw this reflection as a familiar companion, the way a candle flame in a dark room throws a second flame onto the window glass, and she noted without thinking that the ripples were smaller than they had been in the afternoon, the surface of the canal settling toward the glassy stillness of full night. The lantern's glow also caught the gunwale of the boat, picking out the grain of the wood and the worn patches where boots had stood and ropes had rubbed, and it illuminated the lower edge of her shawl, and the backs of her hands where they rested on the tiller, the skin there appearing pale against the surrounding darkness. Everything beyond the small circle of light had now become a uniform blackness. The hedgerow and the meadow and the sky all merged into a single depthless absence, and the wife's world had contracted to the boat and the lantern and the water and the rope stretching forward into the invisibility where the horse and the husband walked. The air had turned distinctly cooler during the few minutes it had taken to light the lantern, as if the darkness itself had brought a physical chill that seeped upward from the water and downward from the emptying sky. The wife felt the change first on her cheeks, where the skin tightened slightly against the bone, and then on the backs of her hands, which had grown cool enough that the warmth of the tiller wood was noticeable by comparison. The scent of the air had altered too, the earlier smell of dry grass and warm earth giving way to something damper and sharper, the scent of dew-soaked vegetation beginning to form on the meadow, and the colder, cleaner smell of wet stone that drifted back from the lock flight still a quarter-mile ahead. She could smell the paraffin from the lantern as well, a faint oily note that hung just at the edge of perception, and underneath it the ever-present mineral scent of the coal in the hold. All of these smells arrived together in a single breath of cool air that moved across the canal from the direction of the open fields, and the wife received them without sorting them, letting them be what they were. The woolen shawl around her shoulders had loosened during the afternoon's work, its ends slipping free of her arms, and she now reached up with her left hand while her right kept the tiller steady and pulled the fabric closer round her neck. The wool was soft and slightly rough at the same time, its fibers holding the residual warmth of her body, and she crossed the ends over her chest and tucked them under her arms so that the shawl became a snug wrapping that covered her from shoulder to elbow. The gesture was small and quick, requiring no thought and interrupting nothing, and when it was done, her left hand returned to its place on the tiller alongside her right, and the boat continued as before. She could feel the cooler air on the small strip of skin that remained exposed between the edge of the shawl and the brim of her bonnet, but the rest of her was warm enough, the shawl doing its quiet work of keeping the night at bay. Far ahead on the towpath another light had appeared, a smaller and more distant point of gold that bobbled slightly with the motion of the horses walking. The husband had lit the bow lantern, a compact brass lamp that hung from a short staff at the front of the boat's cargo hold, its flame protected by a similar glass chimney, and its purpose not to illuminate the path ahead, but to signal the boat's presence to any other craft that might be moving on the canal at night. There were no other craft, and there would be none until morning, but the lighting of the bow lantern was a custom so old that it had become a kind of law, and the husband would no more have neglected it than he would have neglected to feed the horse. The small light swung gently with the motion of the boat, tracing a tiny arc of gold against the darkness, and to the wife it was a second fixed point, in a world that had otherwise dissolved into shadow, a companion to her own lantern and a confirmation that all was well at the far end of the rope. The husband had lit the bow lantern with the same unhurried care that the wife had used for the stern light, though she had not seen him do it. She pictured it instead, the image arriving in her mind without effort, his large hands cupped around the match, the brief flare of sulphur, the glow brightening inside the glass, the click of the chimney settling into place. He would have done it while walking, she knew, his stride never breaking, his body adjusting to the small task with the ease of someone who could tie a knot or roll a cigarette without slowing his pace. The bow lantern now swung from its staff with a motion that was part of the boat's own movement, a gentle bob that rose and fell with the horse's steps and the give of the rope and the slight surge of the water, and its light was a steady presence ahead of her, a small beacon that marked the boundary between the known world of the boat and the unknown darkness beyond. The boat had now entered a stretch of the canal where the towpath was lined on both sides by a row of older trees, their trunks leaning slightly toward the water, and their branches interlocking overhead to form a low, irregular tunnel that was completely black except where the lantern light caught the undersides of the leaves. The leaves were still mostly green, though a few had begun to turn yellow at the edges, and they hung in dense clusters that moved constantly with a motion so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The air beneath the trees was stiller than the open air had been, sheltered from the faint breeze that had been blowing across the fields, and yet the leaves continued their gentle rustling, producing a soft, dry whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wife listened to this sound as she passed beneath the canopy, noting the way it rose and fell in slow waves, the leaves speaking to one another in a language too quiet for human ears to pass. The whisper of the older leaves was joined by the softer sound of the boat's passage, the low hiss of water parting around the bow, and the faint creak of the rope as it stretched and relaxed. The canal here was narrower than in the open reaches, the banks pressing in on either side and the trees leaning close, and the combined effect of the enclosed space and the rustling leaves and the lantern light was one of deep, quiet intimacy, as if the boat had entered a room whose walls were made of leaves, and whose ceiling was the invisible sky. The wife felt this change of atmosphere without naming it, her senses registering the closeness of the trees and the softness of the air, and the way the lantern light now reflected not only on the water, but also on the lower branches, catching a flash of green here and a gleam of smooth bark there. She steered the boat through this living corridor with the same calm attention she had given to the open canal, her hands on the tiller making the tiny adjustments that kept the hull centered between the banks. The breeze, such as it was, barely stirred the lantern flames at all. The stern lantern's glow remained steady and tall, the flame inside the glass chimney burning without so much as a flicker, while the bow lantern bobbed with the boat's motion but kept its light constant. The cool air moved around the boat rather than through it, slipping over the cabin roof and past the wife's shoulders without disturbing the small circle of warmth that the lantern cast on the deck. She could feel the air on her face and on her hands, a reminder that the night was deepening and the temperature was still falling, but the light itself was untouched, a small defiance of the darkness that surrounded it. The boat moved on beneath the alder trees, the leaves whispering their quiet secrets, and the lantern burned without variation, a steady yellow star in a world that had otherwise given itself over to the deep, cool silence of the autumn night. The last of the alder trees slid past the stern, and the canal opened out again into a wider reach, the canopy of leaves giving way to the open sky where the stars had multiplied into their thousands and the thin moon had climbed higher, its silver light now strong enough that the wife could see it reflected as a pale curve on the water. The change from enclosure to openness was marked by a slight freshening of the air, the breeze resuming its gentle pressure against her cheek, and by the return of the wider soundscape, the distant hoot of the owl again, the faint trickle of water from the lock gates ahead, the soft rip of the horse cropping grass somewhere in the darkness. The wife took in these sounds and let them pass, her attention returning to the lantern and the water and the steady, unvarying pull of the rope. The night had settled fully over the Grand Union Canal, and the boat continued its slow progress toward the locks and the mooring, carrying its small lights through the darkness like a message that no one but the stars would read. The boat drifted the final few yards toward the mooring spot below the toplock, with a momentum so slight that it seemed the water itself had grown tired and was gently handing the vessel over to the bank. The wife stood at the stern, the tiller now held loosely in her left hand, while her right hand reached for the coiled mooring line that hung from a cleat beside the cabin door, and she guided the boat toward the grassy verge with the same quiet precision she had used all day, the hull answering each tiny movement of the rudder as if it understood exactly what was required of it. The husband had already led Dolly off the towpath and onto a wide strip of grass that lay between the lock cottage and the upper reach, a place where the canal company had planted a row of young ash trees that cast no shade in the darkness but made a soft rustling sound as the horse brushed past them. The tow rope had been unshipped from the mast and coiled neatly on the cabin roof, its work done for the night, and the boat was now moving under its own gentle way, adrift on the last whisper of its forward progress. The wife nudged the tiller to starboard by a fraction of an inch, and the boat's bow swung slowly toward the bank, closing the gap between the wooden hull and the soft earth with a slowness that was almost ceremonial. The water between the boat and the bank grew narrower and narrower, a ribbon of black that shrank to a thread and then vanished entirely as the hull touched the verge with a sound that was less a bump than a settling, the timbers pressing against the grass and mud with a soft, muffled exhalation. The wife stepped from the deck onto the bank in a single smooth movement, the mooring line in her hand, and she looped it twice around the sturdy wooden bollard that stood at the head of the mooring, a post of weathered oak that had been driven deep into the earth many years before and had held 100 boats in its time. She pulled the line tight and made it fast with a hitch that her fingers tied without conscious direction, the rope looping and crossing in a pattern that was as familiar as the shape of her own name. The boat settled against the bank with a final gentle creak, its hull finding a resting place in the soft mud at the edge of the canal. The wife walked back along the gunwale to the stern, her feet finding the narrow plank without hesitation even in the darkness, and she picked up the stern line from its cleat and stepped ashore again to make it fast to a second bollard set further back. This line she pulled tight until the boat lay snug against the bank along its entire length, the fenders of old rope that hung over the side, compressing slightly between the hull and the earth. She checked the tension of both lines with a brief tug on each, feeling the solid resistance that told her the boat was secure, and then she stood still for a moment on the bank, her hands resting at her sides, her breathing slow and deep. The long day's travel was over, and the boat had come to rest as gently as a leaf settling on water. The quiet that descended now that the engine of movement had stopped was a different quality of silence from the one that had accompanied the journey. It was a stillness that seemed to come from the earth itself, a deep and layered quiet in which the smallest sounds became distinct and meaningful. The wife could hear the husband's voice some distance away, a low murmur of words that were meant for the horse and not for her, and she could hear the soft chink of brass buckles as he unbuckled the harness, working in the dark with the same unhurried care he brought to every task. The sound of the harness being removed was a series of small, discreet noises that told a story she knew by heart. The slight jingle as the belly band was loosened, the heavier clunk of the collar being lifted over Dolly's head and set aside, the soft thud of the traces falling to the grass. Each sound marked another step in the transformation of the horse from a working animal into a creature at rest, and the wife listened to them with a quiet attention that was not quite listening, but something closer to a prayer of thanks. She had no words for. The husband had placed the harness over a low branch of one of the young ash trees, where it hung in a dark tangle of leather and brass, and he now stood beside Dolly with a canvas nose-bag in his hand, the oats inside it rattling softly as he lifted it toward her muzzle. The horse lipped at the bag with a gentle eagerness that was the most excitement she had shown all day, and then she settled into the steady rhythm of chewing, her great jaw working in slow circles while her eyes half closed in contentment. The husband ran his hand along her neck one final time, feeling the warmth of her skin and the slight roughness of her coat where the harness had pressed, and then he left her to her feed and walked back toward the boat, his boots making small sounds on the grass and then on the stone coping of the bank. The wife had returned to the stern deck and was now kneeling beside the cabin door, her hands busy with the small final tasks that always accompanied the end of a day's travel. She checked the lashings on the cargo hold one last time, running her fingers along the rope to feel for any loosening that might have occurred during the day, and she found none. The knots were still tight, the canvas still tight, the coal still secure beneath its cover. She lifted the tiller from its pintle and laid it along the deck, where it would be out of the way until morning, its curved ash arm fitting into a space that had been shaped for it by years of repetition. She wiped down the stern deck with a rag that she dipped in the canal, the water cold on her fingers, the wood darkening under the damp cloth, before drying again in the cool night air. These actions were performed in a slow, deliberate rhythm that had no urgency in it, a quiet closing of the day's accounts that left nothing undone and nothing hurried. Inside the cabin, the darkness was complete, except for the faint glow that came through the open doors from the lantern still burning on its hook outside, a soft rectangle of yellow light that fell across the floor and illuminated the edge of the rag rug. The wife stepped down into this dim interior and moved to the stove, which was cold and waiting, its iron surface smooth and faintly greasy under her touch. She opened the small firebox door and reached for the crumpled sheet of old newspaper that lay ready in the grate, then placed a handful of kindling sticks on top of it in a careful lattice that would catch the flame quickly when the match was applied. The coal in the scuttle beside the stove was in pieces of precisely the right size, and she selected 3 of them with the same care she had used all day, placing them on top of the kindling in a small pyramid that would burn slowly once the fire was established. A single lucifer match from the tin in her pocket was struck against the iron of the stove itself, the sound sharp and brief in the quiet cabin, and the newspaper caught with a soft whoomph of flame that threw sudden dancing shadows on the painted walls. The fire grew quickly, the kindling snapping and crackling as the flames licked upward around the coal, and within a few minutes the first red glow began to appear at the heart of the pile. The wife closed the firebox door and adjusted the small vent at the bottom to give the fire exactly the right amount of air, a setting she knew by the position of the tiny iron knob that had been worn smooth by countless adjustments. The stove began to radiate a gentle warmth that spread outward into the cabin, touching the painted water cans on their shelf, and the lace-edged cloth and the little china dog with the chipped ear, and the wife stood beside it for a moment, her hands held out to catch the rising heat, her face illuminated by the soft orange glow that escaped through the small gaps around the door. The warmth was a comfort, a presence that filled the small space and pushed back the chill of the autumn night, and she let it soak into her hands and her face for a long, quiet minute before she moved again. The husband had come aboard while she tended the fire, and he was now sitting on the edge of the bed with his boots unlaced and his jacket hanging on its peg by the door, his shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been all day. He said nothing, and neither did she, but the silence between them was the comfortable silence of two people who had been married long enough that words were no longer necessary for communication. She moved past him to the shelf where the tea things were kept, and she measured leaves into the small brown pot with a spoon whose handle had been bent and straightened many times, then poured water from the can into the kettle and set it on the stove to heat. The sound of the water beginning to simmer was a soft, rising note that joined the crackle of the fire and the distant, almost imaginary sound of the canal lapping against the bank. When the tea was made and the cups were filled and the small rituals of the evening had been completed, the husband and wife went back out onto the stern deck and settled themselves on the cabin roof, their backs against the slide, their shoulders touching. The lantern still burned on its hook, but the wife had turned it down to a low, soft glow that was no brighter than a candle, and in that dim light they sat together and looked out over the canal and the loch flight and the dark shapes of the trees that stood against the star-filled sky. The mist had begun to rise while they were inside, a low white blanket that formed just above the surface of the water and rolled slowly across the canal in thin, gauzy layers that shifted and parted with the faintest movement of the air. It wove through the lock gates like a slow-moving spirit, coiling around the balance beams and drifting over the coping stones, and where it touched the water, it seemed to make the surface softer, blurring the reflection of the moon into a smear of silver light. The wife watched the mist with a quiet, unfocused gaze, her mind no longer tracking details or recording observations, but simply resting in the presence of the night and the water, and the slow, gentle movement of the vapor across the canal. She could feel the warmth of the cabin at her back through the open doors and the warmth of her husband's shoulder against her own, and the faint residual warmth of the tea in her stomach, and all of these small comforts combined into a single sense of deep, quiet peace that was too large for words. The day's labor was complete. The boat was secure, the cargo was safe, the horse was fed, the fire was lit, and the canal stretched away into the darkness in both directions, empty and silent and still. Tomorrow there would be locks to work and miles to travel and the same calm rhythm of hoof and rope and tiller. But tonight there was only the mist and the stars, and the quiet breathing of the water against the bank. The owl called again from somewhere in the poplar stand, its voice a low, tremulous note that floated across the fields and over the canal, and the wife heard it as a kind of benediction, the last sound of the evening before the true, deep silence of midnight settled over everything. The mist continued its slow, silent weaving, and the lantern burned its low glow, and the boat rested against the bank as still as a stone, and the husband and wife sat together on the cabin roof without speaking, their thoughts slowing and settling like the embers in the stove. The night deepened around them, and the Grand Union Canal lay silent and peaceful under the cover of the autumn darkness, holding the boat and its people in its ancient, patient embrace.